I've told this story 100 times now, and every single time somebody stops me right at the start and says, "Come on, Tom, that didn't really happen." And I get it. I do. If I hadn't been standing there myself, close enough to smell the smoke, close enough to feel the pavement shudder under my boots, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But I was there, so let me tell you exactly how it went. My name's Tom Hartley. For 26 years, I drove ambulances in central London. Nights, mostly. You see things on those shifts that stay with you, and after a while, your body just knows before your brain does when something's wrong. That instinct never leaves. Even now, retired, doing my little walking tour for tourists who want to see where the royals live, that old wiring still hums under my skin. That morning, I had a group of 9. 2 families from Ohio, a honeymooning couple from Portugal, and an elderly gentleman named Frank who'd come alone and kept calling me young man, which at 58 I rather enjoyed. It was late June, one of those rare London mornings where the sky forgets to be gray. The sun was out, proper out, and the air had that warm, green smell that comes off the parks after a wet night. You could hear the whole city breathing, buses grinding somewhere behind us, a busker near the tube station murdering a Beatles song, pigeons doing their pigeon business, fat and unbothered. We were on the long walk toward the palace. The pavement was thick with people. Tourists everywhere, phones up, everyone chasing the same photograph they'd seen 1,000 times before they ever got on the plane. And of course, standing at his post, still as a painting, was the guard. Now I'd walked past hundreds of these lads over the years. You stop seeing them properly after a while. They become part of the furniture, the red tunic, the black bearskin, the rifle held just so, part of the postcard. But this one caught my eye. I couldn't tell you why at first. He was young, very young, the kind of young where you look at the jaw and think, does your mum know you're out here? But there was something in the way he stood, not stiff, not frozen, something more like coiled, like a man doing a job he took seriously in his bones. Later I'd learn his name, Callum Reeve, 19 years old. A lad from a small town outside Leeds who joined up at 17 because, as his mother told a reporter later, he never could sit still, but he could stand still forever. I'll come back to that. It matters more than you'd think. I stopped my group a respectful distance back and started my usual patter. The bit about the bearskin caps. The bit about how they're not allowed to react, not allowed to speak. How you could stand there dancing the funky chicken and they wouldn't so much as blink. The Americans loved that. One of the dads, a big cheerful bloke in a Bengal shirt, said, "So what happens if you touch him?" And I gave my rehearsed line, "Son, you don't want to find out," and everyone laughed. Reeve didn't laugh. Reeve didn't move. But I'll tell you something, and I've never been able to prove this, so take it how you like. His eyes moved. Not much, barely at all. But as I was talking, I watched his gaze slide, just a fraction, off the crowd in front of him and toward the far side of the road. Toward the corner where the street opened up toward the park. I noticed because that's what I used to do. On the ambulances. When something felt off and you couldn't name it yet, your eyes went looking for it before your mind caught up. I turned to follow his line of sight. Saw nothing, just people, just the ordinary river of a summer morning. I turned back and carried on. That was 10:41 in the morning. I know because Frank, the old boy, checked his watch right then and complained we were behind schedule. At 10:44, the world came apart. I want to be careful how I describe this because I've noticed people expect an explosion to sound a certain way. Films have taught us all wrong. They give you a big cinematic boom, drawn out, dramatic. That's not what it was. It was a crack, one crack, flat and enormous and impossibly quick, like the sky itself had been slapped. It came from the direction of the park, a few hundred yards off, maybe more. And then the sound arrived properly, a low punch you felt in your chest more than heard, and a half-second later a rolling boom that bounced off every building at once so you couldn't tell where it had come from. The pavement moved, I swear it did. Just once a single hard jolt up through my heels. And then, for exactly one heartbeat, everything went silent. That's the part nobody believes, and it's the truest part of all. The whole street, hundreds of people, went dead quiet. Every phone froze mid-photo, every mouth open. That awful pause where the human animal is deciding whether it's really happening. Then the screaming started. I've been in mass casualty scenes before. Train crashes. A gas explosion in a block of flats back in 2004. And the thing about panic is it's got a shape to it. It moves like water. it finds the low ground. The crowd broke all at once. People running in every direction, which is the worst thing, because half of them ran toward the sound before they understood what it was, and half ran away, and they collided in the middle. A pram got knocked. A woman went down. Somewhere a child was shrieking that pure high note that goes straight through your spine. My group scattered. I grabbed for the ones I could, the Portuguese lad, one of the Ohio mums, and I got them back against the railings, shouting at them to stay low, stay together, don't run into the road. Over the top of the chaos, I could see smoke now. A dirty gray column rising above the trees toward Hyde Park, leaning slowly in the breeze. Car alarms had started up in a chorus. Somewhere already, sirens, distant, then less distant. And through all of it, I looked back at the guard. He hadn't moved. I mean that literally. In the middle of a bomb going off, in the middle of 100 people losing their minds, Callum Reeve was standing exactly where he'd been standing at 10:41. Feet together, rifle at his side, bearskin dead level. The only thing different was his eyes. And his eyes were wide open now, sweeping left, right, near, far, reading the crowd the way I used to read a wreck. Cataloging, counting exits, working. There's a word soldiers use. Switched on, he was switched on. Frank, the old boy, had ended up next to me at the railing, breathing hard, his face gray. "What is it?" he kept saying. "What's happening, young man?" "I don't know yet," I told him, and that was the truth. "But you're all right. Just stay by me." Here's the thing about a bombing, and it's the thing they train first responders to remember and everyone else forgets. The first blast is rarely the whole story. Because you have to ask yourself, why here? Why a nothing corner of the park, a few hundred yards from the most protected building in the country? If someone wanted carnage, that wasn't where the crowd was. The crowd was here, packed 6 deep along the palace approach. I didn't think all that through cleanly in the moment, but some old part of me felt it, a wrongness underneath the wrongness. The blast pulled everyone's eyes and everyone's fear toward the park. And the whole time, the thing worth protecting was behind us. I'd find out later I was right. But in that moment, all I had was a bad feeling, and a 19-year-old boy in a red coat who wouldn't leave his post. The crowd kept churning. People were on their phones now, filming the smoke, shouting into cameras. Someone near me was sobbing that it was a terrorist attack, saying it over and over, and I wanted to tell her to be quiet because panic is contagious and she was spreading it, but there wasn't time. Then I heard the engines. Not sirens, engines. Heavy ones. Coming in fast from behind us, from the direction of the main road, that deep diesel growl of big vehicles being driven hard. I turned and saw them come round the corner. 2 black vans and a low, armored-looking 4x4, tires barking on the tarmac as they braked. And the doors were already opening before they'd fully stopped. Men came out, and my first reaction, my honest gut reaction, was relief, because they looked exactly like what you want to see arriving at a scene like that. Black tactical gear head to toe, helmets, balaclavas, vests bristling with kit, rifles up and ready, moving in that fast, low, professional stack, one man's hand on the next man's shoulder, sweeping the crowd with their muzzles. Americans would call them SWAT. Over here it's Armed Response Counter-Terror Units, but the shape of them is universal. Fast, hard, faceless men who arrive when everything's gone wrong. I thought, thank God, the cavalry. The crowd thought so too. You could feel the panic shift. People started pointing them out to each other, and there was almost this ripple of relief, this sense of okay, the professionals are here now, someone's in charge. There were maybe 8 of them. They moved up the pavement in a tight line, fast, straight toward the palace gates. Straight toward Reeve. And I remember thinking in the mess of that moment, a small, strange thought that didn't fit. They're not going to the smoke. The bomb had gone off behind them toward the park. Every instinct says you move toward the incident. You go where the wounded are. These men had their backs to it. They were moving away from the blast, toward the gates, toward the boy in the red coat. I didn't have time to make sense of it. It just registered, the way a wrong note registers in a song you know well. They reached the outer edge of the crowd and started shoving through. Not gently, hard, rifle stocks and shoulders. A woman got knocked flat and nobody stopped for her. And people were letting them through, of course they were, because they were the good guys, weren't they? They were here to help. The lead man reached the railings near the sentry post, reached Reeve. And Reeve, who had not moved a muscle in 4 minutes of chaos, finally moved. He turned his head, slowly, deliberately, and he looked at them. I was maybe 40 feet away. I couldn't hear what was said, the street was too loud, alarms and sirens and screaming, but I could see the shapes of it. The lead man in black said something to Reeve. Jerked a thumb toward the gate, the universal gesture for move, get out of the way, stand down. And Reeve didn't move. The man said it again. You could see his whole body lean into it, aggressive now, getting in the boy's face. 2 of the others peeled off and started toward the gate itself, toward the pedestrian entrance beside the sentry box. And Reeve shifted his rifle. It was the smallest thing. He brought it up off his side across his body, a ready position, and he stepped 1 clean step directly into the path of the 2 heading for the gate. 19 years old, alone blocking 8 armed men. The lead man grabbed him. I'll never forget it. This big armored figure just reached out and seized Reeve by the front of his tunic, that beautiful red coat, and hauled him sideways, trying to physically throw him off his post. And the crowd around me actually cheered, some of them, because they thought they were watching police move a stubborn soldier out of harm's way. I heard a man near me say, "Good, get the kid to safety." But my stomach had gone cold, because I'd seen the boots. I'd been staring at those men as they came past, the way you do, and something had snagged on me and I hadn't caught it until right then. The boots were wrong, all 8 of them different boots. Trainers' work boots, 1 pair of scuffed brown leather. No unit ever kits out like that, not counter-terror, they match, they're issued. They're identical down to the laces. And their kit didn't sit right. Vests too loose on some, straps flapping, 1 man's helmet clearly too big, rocking on his head as he moved. They looked like men who had bought tactical gear rather than been trained in it. And the boy in the red coat, the 19-year-old from outside Leeds, had known it before I had. Because he hadn't stepped aside for the cavalry. He'd stepped in front of them. That's where I have to leave it for now. Because what happened in the next 90 seconds is the reason I still can't sleep some nights, and the reason I'll tell this story to anyone who will stand still long enough to hear it. But I need you to understand where we were. A boy in a red coat, 8 men in black, a bomb still smoking in the park. And a crowd of hundreds who had it exactly backwards, cheering for the wrong side. The hand was still gripping Callum Reeve's tunic when the boy moved. I've watched a lot of things go wrong fast in my life. Cardiac arrests, car wrecks, fights outside pubs at 2 in the morning, and I've learned that real speed, proper, trained speed doesn't look fast. It looks calm. It looks like someone doing something they've done 10,000 times, and you only realize afterward how quick it actually was. That's what this was. Reeve didn't wrench away. He didn't panic. He rolled with the grip, turned into it, not against it, and did something with the rifle and his elbow that I couldn't follow, and suddenly the big man in black wasn't holding Reeve anymore. Reeve was holding him. The armored figure went down onto 1 knee on the pavement. His own arm bent up behind him at an angle arms aren't meant to go. And Reeve was standing over him, absolutely upright, that bearskin still dead level on his head, using the rifle across the man's back to pin him like he was folding a deck chair. The whole thing took maybe a second and a half. And the cheer that had gone up from the crowd, that "good, move the kid" cheer, died in everyone's throat at once. Because now it looked wrong. Now it looked like a soldier attacking a policeman. And I felt the mood swing, felt the crowd start to turn against Reeve, and there was actually a moment where a bloke near me shouted, "Oi, leave him, he's police," and started forward like he was going to help the man in black. I grabbed his arm. I don't know what made me do it. I just knew the way you know, and I said, "No, don't look at their boots." He looked at me like I was mad, fair enough. But then it all stopped being about the crowd, because the other 7 reacted. 2 of them swung their rifles up toward Reeve. And here's a detail I'll never shake, they hesitated. They pointed the weapons and they froze. Because I think in that instant they realized the same thing the boy had already known. If they opened fire in front of 100 phones on a royal sentry in daylight, whatever their plan was, it was finished. Dead men can't complete a mission. And more than that, I think some animal part of them wasn't sure the guns even worked the way they'd hoped, wasn't sure they were the men they'd dressed up as. That hesitation was everything. That half-second was the whole story. Because Reeve used it. He didn't try to fight 7 armed men. He wasn't a fool. What he did was shout. And God, the voice on him. This wasn't a 19-year-old's voice. This was a parade ground bellow, a sound that cut clean through the alarms and the sirens and the screaming, a sound with iron in it. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught the shape of it. A challenge, sharp and formal, the kind of thing sentries are drilled to shout, followed by one word I heard perfectly clearly because he threw everything he had into it. Imposters! He was shouting it to the crowd, to the world, to the phones. He was telling everyone, all at once, the thing that took me 40 seconds to work out from the boots. These men are not what they appear to be. And it worked, not on the attackers, on the crowd. You could feel it land. The whole mood snapped a second time, faster than the first, that terrible collective intake of breath as hundreds of people simultaneously understood they'd been about to help the wrong side. The man Reeve had pinned started thrashing, cursing, and his accent, when it came, wasn't wearing any uniform at all. He was screaming at the others to move, to go, the timing's blown, go, go. And that's when I understood the whole thing. The bomb in the park hadn't been the attack. It had been the doorbell. A distraction precisely placed to empty the approach of anyone official and pull every eye and every armed real responder toward the smoke. So that 8 men in bought costumes could walk straight up to the gate in the chaos, wearing the one disguise nobody questions in an emergency, the disguise of the rescuers, and get through while everyone was looking the other way. And it had been a good plan, a frighteningly good plan. It had exactly one flaw in it. It hadn't accounted for a 19-year-old who noticed boots. 2 of the imposters broke for the pedestrian gate, and Reeve, still with the first man half-pinned, did the only thing one man against many can do. He didn't try to catch them. He made himself the wall they had to climb. He kicked the man he was holding forward, hard, sent him sprawling into the path of the 2 runners, and they went down in a tangle of limbs and dropped Kit right in the gate itself. And the whole assault jammed up in that narrow gap like water hitting a blocked drain. And now, finally, the crowd moved, but this time it moved right. Because when 100 frightened people are given a clear enemy and a hero to stand behind, something ancient wakes up. I saw the big American dad from my group, the one in the Bengal's shirt, the one who'd made the joke about touching the guard. I saw him put his shoulder down and go into the pile like it was the 4th quarter. I saw 2 young lads in tracksuits pile in behind him. A woman was hitting one of the men with a folded pushchair, absolutely walloping him, screaming. It was chaos, it was ugly. It was ordinary, terrified people who'd finally understood which way to point their fear. And in the middle of it stood Reeve, not flailing, not lost in it, working. Every time one of the imposters got half up, the boy put him back down. Precise, economical, never more force than the moment needed. He'd position himself again and again between the men and the gate, like the gate was a person he loved and he would not let them past. I finally moved too, old instincts. There was a woman down near the railings from the first crush, the one who'd been knocked flat, and she wasn't getting up, and that's my language that I understood, so I went to her. Airway, breathing, talking to her, keep her still. Frank, bless him, the old boy, knelt down beside me and held her hand and told her she was going to be fine. And I've never loved a stranger more than I loved Frank in that minute. So I had my back half turned when the real ones arrived. And this time, there was no mistaking them. You want to know the difference between the fake and the real? I'll tell you. It's not the guns. It's not even the boots, though the boots matched now, every last man identical. It was the silence of them. The imposters had been loud, aggressive, all show. The real armed police came up that street like a machine, low, fast, quiet, no wasted movement, no shouting until the exact instant shouting was a tool, and they read the whole scene in about 1 second flat. And here's the thing I need you to understand, the thing that still gets me. When they came up on that heap of bodies at the gate, when they saw a royal sentry standing over 8 men in tactical gear, a lesser plan, a lesser story, ends here with a terrible mistake. Because from the outside it could have looked like anything. But Reeve didn't move a wrong muscle. The instant he clocked the real unit, and he clocked them faster than I did, he changed. He didn't drop his guard, but he changed his whole shape. Rifle up and clear, made safe, held out to the side. Free hand open and high. And he called out to them, sharp and clear, identifying himself, his post, and then, this is the part. He pointed at the men on the ground and gave them, in about 6 words, exactly what they needed to know. Not soldiers, not police. Imposters, gate breach. Blast is the diversion. He handed them the whole picture, clean, in one breath, in the middle of hell. And they believed him. Instantly. Because everything about the boy, the way he stood, the way he'd made his weapon safe, the words he used, told a trained man in 1 second that this was one of ours, and he was switched on, and he was right. They took it from there. Of course they did. 8 against 8, real against fake, is a very short fight. It was over in under a minute. Zip ties, faces in the pavement, shouted commands. The crowd shoved back, away from the gate. And through all of it, do you know what Callum Reeve did? He went back to his post. I'm not being poetic. I watched him. Once the real officers had control, once the men on the ground were secured and hands were on them, this 19-year-old boy stepped back, checked, actually physically checked, that the pedestrian gate behind him was still secure, put his hand on it. And then he returned to his exact spot on the sentry line, brought his heels together, brought his rifle back to his side, leveled that bearskin and went still. Blood on his knuckles, tunic torn half off one shoulder, chest heaving, and still. Back on duty. Like the last 4 minutes had been a small interruption to the actual job, which was to stand there. I've thought about that more than any other part of it, more than the fight, that he went back to standing still. I need to stop the story here for a moment, because there's a piece you can't see from where I was standing, and I only learned it later, and it changes how you hear everything that came after. The men weren't after the building. That's what everyone assumed at first, and it's what the papers ran with for the first day. But it came out in the weeks after, in the reporting and the trial, that the target that morning wasn't the palace itself. It was who was inside it. There was a member of the family present that morning who was not supposed to be, a change of schedule, a private thing, the kind of detail the public never hears about. And somehow these men had learned of it. That's why the plan existed at all. That's why the bomb, the costumes, the whole terrible clockwork of it. They had one window, one route, one morning. And it ran directly through the gate that a 19-year-old was standing in front of. I didn't know any of that yet, kneeling on the pavement with an unconscious woman and old Frank holding her hand. I just knew a boy in a red coat had done something I couldn't fully explain. But I would learn it, we all would. And I'll tell you the rest, the aftermath, the thing his mother said, the reason I still can't get through this story without stopping, in a moment. The strangest thing about the minutes after was how normal the boy tried to make himself. The scene by then had become what these scenes become. Ambulances, real ones, and I felt a pang seeing them, an old man missing his old job, nosing through the cleared road. Police tape going up in that fast professional way, one officer walking backward trailing it while another anchored it. The smoke over the park thinning now, going pale, the fire crews already on it. And the crowd, held back behind the tape, had turned every phone in London toward one spot. Toward Reeve. Standing there, torn coat, bloodied hand, back on his post as if nothing had happened, refusing, flatly refusing, to acknowledge the hundreds of people now calling out to him. Because that was still the job, do you understand? The threat was contained, but the duty wasn't over, and in his head, I think, until someone with the authority to do so formally relieved him, he was still on sentry, and a sentry does not chat, does not wave, does not perform. So he stood. And the more he refused to react, the louder the crowd got, until it wasn't fear anymore in their voices. It was something closer to awe. A senior officer came to him eventually. I watched it. An older man, plain clothes over body armor, clearly someone in charge. And there was a short exchange, and then the officer did something I didn't expect. He stepped back and he saluted him. This gray-haired man, this senior figure, saluted a 19-year-old with a torn coat. And only then, only when he'd been properly, formally relieved when another guardsman had come to take the post, did Callum Reeve finally stand down. And the second he did, the second the duty came off him, I watched the boy underneath the soldier come back. His shoulders dropped. His hands started shaking, the bloodied one, the adrenaline finding its way out now that it was allowed to. He looked suddenly exactly as young as he was. They walked him off toward the vehicles, and as he went, the crowd did a thing I have never seen a London crowd do before or since. They went quiet and they clapped. Not a roar, not football crowd noise. A low, steady, almost gentle applause that followed him the whole way, hundreds of people who understood they'd just watched something they'd tell their grandchildren about. The 2 Ohio families were in it, the Portuguese couple. Old Frank, standing now, clapping with tears just running down his face, not even wiping them. I didn't clap, I couldn't. I was still on my knees with the injured woman until the paramedics reached us, and I did my handover the way I've done 1,000 handovers, and one of the young medics looked at me and said, "You job." Meaning, "Are you one of us?" And I said, "Used to be." And he nodded like that was enough, and it was. She was all right, by the way, the woman. Concussion, a broken wrist. She found me a month later through the tour company, brought me a bottle of whiskey I still haven't opened. Said Frank had held her hand the whole time and she never got his name. I didn't have it either. I've thought about that a lot. How you can share the worst minute of your life with someone and never learn what to call them. Here's what came out afterward, in the days and weeks that followed, pieced together from the papers and the trial and the one interview that mattered. 8 men, not one of them what they'd claimed to be. The tactical gear had been bought, piece by piece, online and from surplus shops, which is exactly why it didn't match. Why the boots were wrong, why the vests hung loose, why one man's helmet rocked on his head. The bomb in the park had been placed precisely to draw the real armed response units away, and to flood the approach with the kind of chaos in which men in black are waved through instead of questioned. It was, the investigators said, a genuinely sophisticated plan, well-funded, well-rehearsed. It had accounted for the police response, the crowd behavior, the timing of the shift change at the gate, everything. Everything except that a sentry's whole training is to notice, to stand for hours doing apparently nothing, and in that nothing to see. And that a particular 19-year-old, standing that particular post, had spent the 40 seconds before the blast doing the one thing that unraveled all of it, watching a group of men move wrong, dressed wrong, carrying themselves wrong, and filing it away in that switched-on head of his before a single bomb had even gone off. Remember at the very start when I told you his eyes moved, before anything happened, when I followed his gaze across the road and saw nothing. He hadn't seen nothing, he'd seen them, gathering, getting ready. He'd already been suspicious before the world came apart. So when they came for the gate in their bought costumes, he wasn't fooled for even a heartbeat because he'd already been watching them for 3 full minutes. That's the part that undoes me. It wasn't luck, it wasn't even really the fight. It was the standing still. It was all those hours, all those days, all those seemingly pointless, motionless shifts that people walk past and photograph and laugh at. That's what trained the eyes that saw it coming. His mother gave one interview, just the one, and a reporter asked her if she'd been frightened when she saw the footage, saw her boy alone against 8 armed men. And she said, and I'm going to get this as close to right as I can remember it, she said no. She said she'd been many things watching it, but frightened wasn't one of them because she knew her Callum, and she said, he never could sit still as a boy, drove me to distraction, but he could always stand his ground, from the time he could walk. You could not move that child off a thing he'd decided was right. And then she said the line that ended up on the front of 2 newspapers, the line I still hear in my head some nights. She said, they tried to move a boy who'd made up his mind he wasn't moving. They never had a chance. They gave him a medal, eventually. There was a small ceremony. He looked in the photographs, deeply uncomfortable with all of it, this lad who plainly just wanted to go back to work. But that's not the image I keep. The image I keep is from that morning. Right at the end, just before they walked him off, there was a second, half a second, where he was still standing his post, torn and bloodied, and a little girl at the front of the crowd, maybe 5 years old, held up over the tape by her dad, gave him a small, shy wave. And Callum Reeve, who would not react to the screaming, would not react to the applause, would not react to 100 phones or a bomb or 8 armed men. He broke his stance just barely, just enough, and he gave that little girl the smallest nod. One nod for her. Then he was still again. I've told this story 100 times, like I said, and people always want to know the same thing at the end. They want to know what the lesson is, what it means. And for a long time I didn't have an answer because I was too close to it, too tangled up in the smoke and the noise and the woman on the pavement and Frank's tears. But I think I've got it now. I think it's this. We spend our whole lives being told the loud ones win. The fast ones, the big ones, the ones who come roaring round the corner in black vans looking like the answer to everything. And that morning, for about 4 minutes, every single person on that street believed exactly that. We cheered for the loud men. We nearly helped them. And the thing that actually saved us was the quietest thing on the street. A boy who'd learned how to stand still, who'd learned how to look, who'd decided before any of us understood anything at all that he was not going to move. The world tried to overpower him that day, sent everything it had, noise and fire and fear and 8 men in costumes. And a 19-year-old in a red coat looked at all of it and didn't take a single step back. I think about that when I think the world's too big to stand against. One boy, one post, one decision made up front and held to the end. They never had a chance. I said I'd tell you the rest, and the rest is really where this stops being a story about 4 minutes and becomes a story about the year that followed. Because the strange thing about that morning is that it didn't end when the vans drove off. It kept happening to all of us quietly for a long time after. The first thing I remember once the scene calmed was the walking wounded being counted. And I need to say this plainly because it matters. Nobody died that day. The bomb in the park had been placed to make noise and smoke and panic, not to kill a few injuries from flying debris, a man who lost most of his hearing in one ear, some cuts. And the crush on the approach, the human panic, did more damage than the device itself. That woman with the broken wrist, a twisted ankle here. A heart scare there, an older gentleman who'd gone down clutching his chest and turned out, thank God, to have only frightened himself half to death. I mention it because for weeks afterward people would say to me, "That terrible bombing," and shake their heads, and I'd have to gently tell them, the bomb was never the point. The bomb was the knock at the door. And the reason it wasn't worse, the reason nobody stood at a graveside because of that morning, traced back, when you followed the thread all the way down, to one boy who wouldn't move off a patch of pavement. But I'm getting ahead of myself. They took Callum Reeve to hospital that morning, and here's a small thing I love. He didn't want to go. It came out later. One of the officers told a journalist that the boy kept insisting he was fine, that he wanted to stay, that he wanted to know if his relief had proper eyes on the gate. 19 years old, knuckles split to the bone, tunic hanging off him, and his concern was whether someone was still watching the gate. They made him go. He had a hairline fracture in one hand that he hadn't even felt, a couple of cracked ribs from the scrum, and a cut above his eye that needed stitches. All of it, every injury, sustained keeping 8 men off a gate. I went home that afternoon and I couldn't settle. You'd think after 26 years on the ambulances, a man would be hardened to a bad morning. But this was different, and it took me days to understand why. It wasn't the violence. I'd seen violence. It was the wrongness of the crowd. It was the memory of hundreds of good, kind, ordinary people, myself very nearly among them, cheering for the men in black. It was how close we'd all come to helping the wrong side, simply because the wrong side arrived looking the way help is supposed to look. That kept me up at night for weeks, the ease of it, how a costume and a confident walk had nearly been enough. The investigation came out in pieces the way these things do. First the frantic early reporting, half of it wrong. Then, slowly, the real shape of it. 8 men, I told you they'd bought their gear, and that's true, but the men themselves were more organized than the mismatched boots suggested. They'd trained. Not properly, not like real operators. The real officers who arrived that day would tell you the difference was night and day, but they'd rehearsed. They'd walked the route in plain clothes on ordinary days more than once, timing the shift changes at the gate, learning the rhythm of the crowd, working out exactly when the approach was thickest and most confused. They'd studied how emergencies unfold in that part of London. They'd understood correctly that in the first minutes of a bombing, nobody stops a man in tactical gear. Everyone gets out of his way. It was, the report said in its careful language, a plan that showed real understanding of how people behave under fear. And that was the chilling part. They hadn't planned to overpower the security. They'd planned to walk through the gap that fear opens up, to use our own panic as a door. And it very nearly worked. The one variable they couldn't plan for was attention. A single sentry, on a single post, who happened to be exactly the sort of young man who notices things. Who'd spent 40 seconds before the blast watching a cluster of men across the road and thinking, quietly, in that switched-on way, something's off about that group. Who was therefore already suspicious, already primed, already unwilling to be fooled, when the whole world came apart and they made their move. The investigators found that Reeve had actually attempted to flag his suspicion before the bomb. This detail didn't make the papers much, but it came out at the trial. In the minutes before the blast, he'd used a discreet signal, the sort sentries are trained to give, to alert a colleague that he'd clocked something worth watching across the road. He hadn't been able to say why. He'd just known. The system was in the middle of registering his flag when the device went off. Think about that. He was already sounding the alarm before anyone else on that street had the faintest idea anything was wrong. I got pulled into it in a small way because I'd been a witness, and it turned out a useful one because I'd noticed the boots too, just too late, and I could speak to the sequence of it, the timing, what the crowd had done. I gave a statement. I sat in a plain room with two very patient detectives and walked them through my morning minute by minute, from Frank checking his watch to the medic asking if I was job. One of them near the end put his pen down and asked me, off the record, he said, what I'd made of the guardsman, man to man. And I told him the truth. I said I'd spent 26 years arriving at scenes after everything had already gone wrong. I said my whole career had been about cleaning up the aftermath of the worst minute of people's lives. And I said that in all those years, I'd almost never seen someone actually stop the worst minute from happening. Prevention doesn't make the news the way disaster does. You never get to see the crash that didn't happen. But I saw one, I told him. That morning I saw the crash that didn't happen, and it was one kid deciding not to move. The detective nodded slowly and picked his pen back up, and he said something I've held on to. He said, "That's the job, though, isn't it? 99 days of standing still for the one day it matters, and nobody ever thanks you for the 99. I think about that a lot, the 99 days nobody sees. The media storm was enormous, and it was ugly in the way these things always are. For about a week, Callum Reeve was the most famous 19-year-old in Britain, and he wanted no part of it. The footage was everywhere, a dozen angles, filmed on a dozen phones by the very crowd whose panic had nearly doomed them. You could watch it from any direction, and people did millions of times. But here's what struck me about the footage and about the way people talked about it. Everyone wanted to make it about the fight. The moment he flipped the first man, the moment he shouted imposters. The drama of 1 against 8. And I understood that it's the exciting part, it's the part that makes a good clip. But it wasn't the important part. Anyone can throw a punch. The important part was the 3 quiet minutes before that nobody filmed because nobody knew to, when a boy was simply standing still and watching. The fight was just the last 2%. The other 98 was attention, was patience, was a young man doing the boring, invisible, essential work of paying attention when there was, apparently, nothing to pay attention to. That's what I kept trying to tell people, and mostly they'd nod and then say, "But did you see when he flipped that guy, though?" I'd give up and say yes, I saw it, it was something. Part 4. The part I haven't told you yet, the part I only fully understood months later, when the trial laid it all out, is why. Why 8 men would build a plan that elaborate, spend that money, take that risk, to get through one gate on one particular morning. I told you earlier it wasn't the building, it was who was inside it. I'm going to be careful here, the way the reporting was careful, because some things about that morning were never made fully public, and I don't think they should be. But the shape of it is this. There was a member of the royal household present that day whose presence had not been announced, whose being there at all was the result of a last-minute private change to a schedule. The sort of change that, in theory, only a handful of trusted people should have known about. The men had known about it. That was the whole reason for the operation. That was why this morning, this gate, this window. They had learned something they should never have been able to learn, and they had built their entire terrible clockwork around a single, narrow opportunity. The bomb, the costumes, the timing, all of it existed to exploit a few minutes of access that would never come again. And the route to that access ran through one pedestrian gate, guarded on that particular morning by a 19-year-old from outside Leeds. When I finally understood that, sitting in the public gallery during the trial, I had to leave the room for a few minutes, because it reframed everything. It meant the boy hadn't just stopped a break-in. He hadn't just foiled a robbery or a stunt. What he'd stood in front of without knowing the full shape of it was an attempt to reach a person. And the only thing between that person and 8 determined men had been Callum Reeve, deciding, in a fraction of a second, on instinct sharpened by 3 quiet minutes of watching, that he was not going to step aside. At the trial, the prosecution played the footage, all of it, and they walked the jury through it not as a fight, but as exactly what it was, a security failure that was caught and reversed by a single individual doing his job with extraordinary attention. They showed the moment his eyes moved before the blast. They showed the discreet signal he'd given his colleague. They showed him step into the path of the 2 men heading for the gate. They showed him make his weapon safe the instant the real officers arrived. and hand them the whole situation in one clean breath. The barrister said something in her closing that I wrote down on the back of my train ticket so I wouldn't lose it. She said the defendants had planned for every system, the police response, the crowd, the alarms, the barriers. What they had not and could not plan for was a human being who was fully present. You cannot, she said, build a plan that accounts for someone simply paying attention. There is no defeating it. You can only hope it isn't there. And that morning it was there. There is no defeating it. You can only hope it isn't there. I've never forgotten that line. All 8 were convicted. I won't go through the sentences. It isn't really the point of the story, and it doesn't bring me any satisfaction to recite them. What stays with me instead is a smaller thing from during the trial itself. Callum Reeve had to give evidence, and I was in the gallery for it, and I'll tell you, I was worried for him. He was still so young. The footage of the fight made him look like something out of a film, but a courtroom is a different kind of pressure, slow, verbal, exposed. And I didn't know how a 19-year-old would hold up under a defense barrister trying to twist his every word. I needn't have worried. He came in a plain suit rather than the red coat, and he looked, if anything, smaller than he had that morning. Ordinary, a young lad in an ill-fitting jacket. And then he started answering questions, and it was the same quality I'd seen at the gate, translated into words. Complete stillness. No embellishment, no drama, just the plain, exact truth delivered in the fewest words that would carry it. The defense tried at one point to suggest he couldn't possibly have known the men were imposters, that he'd simply gotten lucky, panicked, attacked what turned out, coincidentally, to be criminals, that it was reckless, that he could have caused a bloodbath, attacking men he had no proof weren't police. And Reeve answered, I'm reconstructing, but this is close. He answered that he hadn't attacked anyone, that his first action had been to stand still and block a gate, which is precisely his duty and the opposite of reckless. That he had escalated only when a man laid hands on him and others moved for the gate. And then he said the thing that, I think, ended that line of questioning entirely. He said the barrister was right that he'd had no proof, but that a sentry doesn't get proof. A sentry gets a few seconds and a lifetime of training in what wrong looks like and has to decide. And he said, quietly, no heat in it at all, that if he'd waited for proof, the men would have been through the gate before he had it, and then it would have been too late to matter what he'd decided. My job isn't to be certain, he said. My job is to not let them through until someone who can be certain gets there. The gallery was completely silent. Even the barrister didn't have a follow-up for a moment. My job is to not let them through until someone who can be certain gets there. I've turned that over in my head more times than I can count, because isn't that most of the important work anyone ever does? Not the dramatic certainty, not the grand gesture, just holding the line imperfectly without full information until the people who can properly fix it arrive. Standing in the gap. Refusing to let the wrong thing through on your watch, even though you can't be sure, even though it might cost you. Most of the good in the world is people holding a gate they're not certain about until help comes. Part 5. I met him. That's the part I've been building to, and I've saved it for the end because it's the part that means the most to me, and I want to get it right. It was almost a year after. The tour company I work for had, in the way these things go, become minor caretakers of the story. I was, apparently, the tour guide who was there, and people would book tour half hoping I'd tell it, and I usually would because the truth of it deserved telling, and because it kept the real version alive against all the exaggerated ones floating around online. And somehow, through the injured woman with the whiskey bottle, actually, who'd stayed in touch and who'd become something of a friend, a quiet meeting got arranged. Nothing official, no cameras. Callum Reeve, out of uniform, agreed to meet the ambulance man and the tour guide and old Frank, who I'd tracked down at last, who lived in a little flat in Pimlico, and who wept when I rang him because he'd never learned the fate of the woman whose hand he'd held. The 4 of us sat in a quiet corner of an ordinary pub. And I have to tell you, it was almost funny how normal he was. This lad whose face had been on every front page, who'd stood alone against 8 men, sat there with a lemonade. He didn't drink, looking faintly embarrassed by the whole business, and mostly wanting to talk about anything other than that morning. He asked Frank about his life. He asked the woman about her wrist, whether it had healed properly, whether she'd got full movement back. He asked me about the ambulances, real questions, good ones, the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to know rather than someone making conversation. It took us the better part of an hour to even get near the subject we'd all come for, because he kept steering us gently away from it. But eventually Frank, who has no filter at all, bless him, just leaned across and said, "Weren't you frightened, son? 8 of them." And Reeve was quiet for a moment, and then he gave the most honest answer I've ever heard anyone give to that question. He said there wasn't time to be frightened during. The fear came after, that night. It's still coming if I'm honest. But in the moment, no. In the moment, there's just the next thing to do, and then the next thing, and you do them. The fear waits until you've got space for it. I've thought about that answer more than almost anything else from that whole year, because I recognized it. Every ambulance driver, every nurse, every firefighter recognizes it. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's just that fear, mercifully, is patient. It waits. It lets you get the job done first, and then it comes and sits with you in the dark afterward. And the measure of a person isn't whether they feel it, everyone feels it. It's whether they can make it wait until the work is finished. I asked him the question I most wanted answered. I asked him how he'd known, before the bomb. Those 3 minutes when I saw his eyes move and followed them and saw nothing. What had he actually seen? And he thought about it, and he said he wasn't sure he could put it into words in a way that would satisfy me. He said it wasn't any one thing. It was a collection of small wrongnesses that added up. The way the group of men across the road were standing too still for tourists but too loose for anyone official. The way they kept looking at the gate and then not looking at it. The deliberate not looking that's louder than staring. The mismatched kit visible even at that distance to someone trained to look for uniformity. The fact that they didn't have phones out. Everyone has a phone out. A group of grown men in that spot with no phones out, watching a gate. That alone, he said, had set something ticking in him. None of it was proof, he said. It was just a feeling that wouldn't go quiet. And you learn to trust that feeling or you learn to ignore it. And they train you on that post to never ignore it, even when it's nothing, especially when it's probably nothing, because the one time it isn't nothing is the whole reason you're standing there. The one time it isn't nothing is the whole reason you're standing there. That's it, isn't it? That's the whole thing. All those hours of standing still that people photograph and laugh at and think are pointless theater, they're not for the tourists. They're a discipline. They're the practice of a kind of attention most of us have completely lost. We can't stand still for 30 seconds anymore without reaching for a screen. And here was a 19-year-old who trained himself to stand still for hours, fully present, watching. And it turned out that skill, that unfashionable, boring, invisible skill, was the exact thing that stood between a person's life and 8 men who'd planned everything except a boy who was actually paying attention. His mother's line came back to me as I sat there. They tried to move a boy who'd made up his mind he wasn't moving. They never had a chance. Before we left, Frank shook his hand for what felt like a full minute and couldn't get any words out at all. Just held it, this old man, and Reeve let him, patient and kind, and understood. And as we were going, I asked Reeve one last thing. I asked whether, knowing everything now, the danger, the fear that still comes at night, the year of it, he'd do it again. And he looked at me like it was the strangest question anyone had ever asked him, like I'd asked whether water was wet. "It's the gate," he said simply. "You don't let them through the gate. That's the whole job. There isn't a version where you let them through." We walked out into an ordinary London evening. The woman with the mended wrist linked her arm through Frank's to help him along. And I stood on the pavement for a minute after they'd gone, thinking about gates, and about all the quiet people standing in front of them all over the world that we never notice and never thank. I do the tour still. I take my little groups down the long approach to the palace, and we stop, and I do my patter, and there's always a guardsman there, still as a painting, red coat, black bearskin, and the tourists laugh and try to make him blink and take the same photograph everyone takes. And every single time I stop for a moment and I look at him, whoever he is that day, and I don't see furniture anymore. I don't see a postcard. I see a person who has trained himself to do the hardest, most unfashionable thing there is. To stand still and stay awake and pay attention on the 99 days when nothing happens, so that he's ready on the one day when everything does. People ask me if I think that morning was a miracle, and I say no. A miracle is something that couldn't be explained. This could be explained perfectly. 8 men made one mistake. They assumed the boy at the gate wasn't really looking. He was. He always was. That's not a miracle. That's just what it looks like when someone actually keeps their post.